Brilliant. Thank you so much for the introduction, Solange, and a warm welcome from my side as well from a very cold Johannesburg, actually. So yeah, good afternoon, and quite excited to talk about evidence maps and how they might support systematic reviews and policy making with you this afternoon. So as Solange said, my name is Laurenz. I work for the Africa Center for Evidence at the University of Johannesburg. Very quick word on ACE. So we are a research center that focuses on evidence synthesis and knowledge translation, in particular in the social science sector. And have been doing work on systematic reviews and evidence map and rapid evidence assessments and all types of evidence synthesis and how these then can be used in decision-making processes. And so today we really want to zoom into one aspect of this work, and that is our evidence mapping program of work. And so the presentation in general is pitched at a beginner's level, so I don't necessarily expect you to have extensive experience on evidence mapping. And so if you do, and if you have done a few maps already, so my apologies in advance, it might be a bit more at a novice level. But yeah, so it's I think a good introduction to evidence maps to understand what they're about and how they might be used. So a very quick point up front about evidence maps, because we had this experience. We talk about maps. This is not what we're talking about. We do not talk about actual geographic maps. We talk about evidence maps, maps of research that quite often take forms like this, and a matrix and a few bubbles, or a different format. So what we will be talking about in evidence mapping is these maps of research evidence rather than any geographical maps. So my apologies to disappoint you if we're looking for actual geographical maps today. But this is what we'll be focusing on. And we'll talk much more in detail around what different forms these maps take and how they might be structured. So to just give you very quickly up front the outline of the objectives of the talk, which is roughly in 5 sections. So we'll start briefly, really, what is evidence mapping, or what are evidence maps, the definitions, to then move into the more technical content of understanding the key steps involved in evidence mapping. And thereafter, we'll have our first break for any immediate questions, particular technical questions related to the actual production of evidence maps. In part 3, we'll then zoom a bit more into the detail on the differences and synergies between evidence maps and systematic reviews and other types of evidence synthesis, to then tease out, well, how can we use this evidence map, both for the production of systematic reviews as well as to inform policy making. And again, we'll have a break in between these for any immediate questions, to then hopefully leave with 10-15 minutes of in-depth discussions afterwards. So I will be stopping between these parts, so you don't have to wait until the very end for your questions, and particularly for clarifications and technical questions. So, well, what is evidence mapping? So you might have seen these weird bubbles and matrices, these interfaces that in the last couple of years have become a bit popular for organizations that produce evidence synthesis. So what we'll be zooming into is to try to explain the research behind these evidence maps that you see in front of you, as well as the technical aspects of programming these, and then how they can be used for decision making. So I hope that at the end of this presentation, if you encounter such an interface, that you have a good understanding of what it is, where it comes from, and what you can actually do with it. So going right into then, well, from a definition point of view, what is an evidence map? So there's a few seminal papers around, if you want to read yourself into the body of literature. And I think the 2 most seminal papers and definition are probably by Lee and colleagues, as well as by Bertie Snilsvik and colleagues. And so Lee, they do define evidence maps to constitute a systematic search of broad field of research to identify gaps in knowledge and future research needs. And the results of these to be presented in a user-friendly format, often a visual figure or a graph or a searchable database. So that is kind of how they define evidence mapping, based on systematic search, looking particularly at gaps and research priorities, and then having this kind of interactive, user-friendly output attached to it. But these Nitzwitz takes a slightly different approach. She defines evidence maps, or evidence gap maps, how they're sometimes referred to as well, as a thematic collection of evidence structured around a framework which schematically presents the types of interventions and outcomes of relevance to a particular sector. So in this definition, what defines the map is really this framework structure, this schema of mapping interventions against outcomes. So two slightly different ways of looking or defining what evidence maps are, but I think equally valid. So from an empirical definition, Miyake Lee has produced a brilliant paper in which she has actually done a systematic review of the definition of evidence maps. So I think we have a very strong empirical basis here for what most papers or most reports that self-identify as evidence map, what do they actually constitute? So, and based on her review of papers that do identify evidence map, 67% assume that the main purpose is actually the identification of research gaps. But also a large number, 58%, define an evidence map as having a very strong focus on the stakeholder engagement process to lead to a user-friendly product. So this idea of the use of the map being used for stakeholders is very strong within the methodology in its own right. All evidence maps that she found did explicitly state that they followed a systematic review approach to evidence synthesis. And then lastly, the last component that in most of the publications she reviewed, again, that there was a figure or a table or some form of online database that was then referred to or pointed out as the particular map or the output of the map. So then again, to recap, it is in the literature at the moment, maps are defined through the investigation of research priorities or research gaps, have a strong component on stakeholder engagement, follow systematic view approaches, and have this one output that is assumed to define the map. So moving into then how, for this presentation and also at the Africa Center for Evidence, how we define evidence maps, we take a slightly different approach in which we prefer to refer to the methodology of evidence mapping and the evidence map as an output of that. So this slight distinction. So this then positions evidence mapping as one of many evidence synthesis methodologies, such as umbrella reviews or scoping reviews or rapid evidence assessments. So this is conceptually how we would frame or position evidence mapping as a methodology. And that then very explicitly says that it's not so much about the figure or database per se, that is more the output of the evidence mapping process. It's not necessarily the methodology, and that can take various forms. It's also, in our language, we prefer to drop the gap from the evidence gap maps, and just to refer to evidence maps or evidence mapping, in particular in the context of systematic reviews, in which you actually are more interested probably in the evidence on the evidence map to then move towards systematic reviews. And the gaps are probably not necessarily the most productive finding of the map per se, which is why we've dropped the gaps from the evidence gap mapping. But in generally, also in our understanding of the methodology of evidence mapping, the key building blocks mentioned before do remain. So it is a key component of an evidence map that it does follow a traditional systematic review approach and its research steps. So the method of systematic reviewing literature with its established track record, its established outlines, that shouldn't be compromised if we talk about an actual evidence map. Likewise, we would also argue that the evidence mapping as a methodology does incorporate some form of interactive visual interface that can be in form of an interactive table or a graph, but this kind of the idea that there is an interactive engagement with the evidence does seem to be a core constituent of the methodology. And then lastly, also again in line with earlier definitions, is that evidence maps do have a rather instrumental emphasis on user engagement. That is, they're being positioned as a tool for user engagement within reviews and with evidence bases more broadly. Which would then leave me to adopt the definition throughout the presentation that evidence mapping is an evidence synthesis methodology to systematically source and organize a body of knowledge, to then provide a high-level overview of the size and nature of the available evidence in order to inform and facilitate the use of this particular evidence. And that is then how I will, like if we talk about evidence mapping going further, this is kind of the understanding behind it. So then very quickly to conclude this first part, well, who does evidence map and where can I find them? So they've been growing quite a bit in the last couple of years, but it's important to acknowledge that systematic maps as a tool or as an approach have been around for a very long time. So probably since the early 1990s, there are maps, systematic maps produced by the Epicenter in London. And actually, probably most of us who've done a systematic review, we do some form of scoping or initial mapping when we get started on reviews. So the idea of mapping the evidence is certainly not necessarily new. I think what is new, or what is more the recent addition, is the incorporation of interactive visual interfaces, the technology component. And if I use that kind of as an exclusion criterion to zoom in which organizations have specialized on these, I arrive at the list below. So there's the Global Evidence Mapping Initiative, which unfortunately the website is currently hacked when I checked it earlier. So this goes to a Chinese diploma shop. And then there's 3IE, the International Initiative for Evaluation, who have piloted evidence gap maps, in particular in the development sector. There's also us, the Africa Center for Evidence, with maps of social science policy areas. There's the International Rescue Committee, which also have done quite a few and quite interesting evidence maps. There is Site Savers, which are supported by the Cochrane Eyes and Vision Group in the production of their evidence maps. And then lastly, there's also the Campbell Collaboration and the Epicenter, who are just about to finish the release of their own software for evidence maps, and you will see these coming along. So Campbell has a few maps registered already, so I would expect in the next 6-7 months the first maps to be published. And then just to say that also the Department for International Development in the UK, as well as the Department for Planning, Monitoring, and Evaluation here in South Africa, do have evidence mapping programs, but unfortunately they're not public, so there's no link for that. So I hope this could give a quick introduction as to how I understand, or how evidence mapping is positioned and how the research has defined it. The next couple of slides will then be on the actual technical steps of doing these maps. And after we've worked through these, I will then take a short break for any clarification questions. So, as I hope came through the definition of evidence maps already, is that they are certainly based on a systematic review approach. So most of the research steps within the evidence map do mirror what you would expect in a full systematic review or a scoping review or a rapid evidence assessment. So the underlying steps do not differ very much. And that's why this graphic in front of you currently is just a slight adaptation of the outline of systematic reviews as used in the introduction to systematic reviews by Gauck and colleagues. So in evidence maps, as in systematic reviews, we begin by clarifying the scope and the question of the map. We then go towards finding the evidence using a scientific search and the screening process. Having found the evidence, we then go into the data extraction and the coding exercise to extract key information on it. And then, and this varies slightly across approaches to evidence mapping, there might be a critical appraisal of the evidence too. And having then done the critical appraisal, or done a more slightly adapted version, we then do not go into synthesis in an evidence map. We go into what I would call the visualization phase, where we organize the evidence and find the right way to present it and analyze it in order to facilitate an interaction with the evidence base. And that involves quite a bit of programming and data visualization in the more recent adaptations. The last step then, using the evidence base, again, you would have that for systematic review too, with a caveat that we're not really talking about the use of a particular research finding in evidence maps. We're talking about the use of an appraised and organized evidence base and what we could do with that. And in the next 10 minutes, I will now then go through each of these steps in a little bit more detail. I am aware that you're familiar with them in general, so I'm not re-explaining them, but just trying to point out where there's particular differences between these review steps within an evidence mapping process. So in the first step, to clarify the question and the scope, well, what types of questions can evidence maps actually answer? So usually evidence maps are tailored for broader research questions than full systematic reviews or other types of evidence synthesis. So it's not necessarily a narrow question that you would investigate with an evidence map, because you have the methodology available to deal with a larger body of research. Therefore, you're at a more descriptive level, and therefore then you can answer broader questions. It's not to say that you have to, but in terms of the traditional use of evidence maps, they do tend to focus on broader questions and systematic reviews. And they then also assume that there is body of evidence available. So if there's a hunch that you're not quite sure if there's a lot of evidence out there, an evidence map might not be necessarily the right approach, because you might end up with just gaps on a map, and that's not necessarily the most meaningful use of the methodology. Evidence mapping is also suitable for all types of research questions. As you would have reviews for more quantitative or more qualitative questions, again, maps are a mirror image of that. So they can answer very descriptive questions. They can also look at evidence of effectiveness, or they can look at more qualitative evidence on perception and views. And what nature this takes, as in reviews, probably depends on stakeholder engagement or the funder's priorities. To give you a little bit of a flavor of what type of questions we have answered through evidence mapping, I gave 3 examples at the bottom of the slide. So one was around a body of evidence that looks at interventions on housing and human settlements, which supports the desired outcomes as outlined in our South African National Development Plan. Another question on labor markets was, what are the effectiveness and the design features of interventions that aim to overcome barriers to women's participation in the labor market in higher growth and male-dominated sectors? Or lastly, a not effectiveness question at all, we did an evidence map of what type of training approaches are used for community healthcare workers for what type of health conditions. So quite a different examples of questions that you can address with evidence maps. The next step then, and this is a slight different to systematic reviews, is, well, how do you develop the mapping framework? And this is slightly different from the conceptual framework in a systematic review, which might be quite elaborate with a theory of change and lots of diagrams. In most evidence maps, actually our conceptual framework is the matrix you see below, where we just map 2 variables against each other, essentially. And it doesn't really matter what these variables are, as long as there is a configuration of evidence on the matrix. So in the first example, I chose a more quantitative framework, where you map evidence, for example, of the degree of participation of communities and then their perception of a particular phenomena. Whereas you could have a more effectiveness approach for the map, where you map the evidence of interventions against the desired outcomes. And this is really just to illustrate that it does not really matter what the variable is, as long as you have 2 variables that mapped against each other give a meaningful picture. And this is an example here of how a mapping framework looks like at the beginning, where it's not yet populated. So this, for example, on top you have outcomes, on the left you have interventions, and then you can see how through how the matrix gives you the grid in the middle where you then populate the evidence. And here, for example, the outcomes were actually structured using a theory of change approach. So it's not to say that you can't bring in any conceptual development within the mapping framework itself. Again, another example of a mapping framework, same thinking, outcomes at top, interventions on the left. And here you can see now that we've started to plot the evidence in a simple heat map approach in the middle between these configurations of interventions and outcomes. And I'll show you a few more graphics just in a few slides. Then just concluding on clarifying the scope of questions. For the selection of evidence for the inclusion criteria, it is a mirror image of systematic reviews. The same principles apply, the same inclusion criteria frameworks can be used, PICO, SPIDER, etc. Probably your evidence mapping question will determine what type of evidence is included. Again, because maps can answer broader questions, you can often include a more broader type of research studies, for example, quantitative and qualitative, or impact evaluations and systematic views within the same evidence map. Whereas in a review, you might have different review approaches for different types of evidence. And that then comes again back to the point that you can, being more descriptive and being able to include a broader range of study, then also means that you have a larger body of evidence to deal with. So it's not uncommon for maps to have inclusion of 200 studies and above. And that does not add too much labor, as you'll see, because in the data extraction, it differs quite a bit from full systematic reviews. Moving to the scientific search for evidence, there's not much to say, but that it's exactly the same as for full systematic review. We do full scientific database searches, we do full grade searches, as well as snowballing, so it is really exactly the same. Likewise, for the screening process, unfortunately, there's no quick shortcut either. You still screen or title and abstract and then a full text, so this hasn't really changed either. Moving then to data extraction, where I think there's a fairly big difference between maps and systematic reviews, and that is that maps do only conduct a high-level data extraction. So they are after key variables of the included evidence to populate it onto the evidence matrix, as well as a few variables needed for filters. So that does mean in practice that you can do a map with only actually extracting 2 variables, the one needed for the framework. And that might be all, if you literally just want to use the framework and have the interactive interface going. And in that sense, then you have a study and all your data extraction does is extract 2 variables, say what intervention is it, what outcome. So you can see how that is quite a bit less than you would do in a full systematic review, where you have to extract data in order to prepare your evidence for meaningful synthesis. And because we don't have this in-depth synthesis in evidence maps, we also don't have to extract as much data. And it's therefore a much quicker process and at a much higher level. So yeah, but at the basic, what you do need is the variables to place the study on the evidence matrix. You also probably need a few contextual variables so you can tailor the map to your user's needs. For example, region, design features, type of population. Design features here meaning intervention design features. Most maps also do have a study design code to understand a bit better what type of evidence is included. But those are then the usual suspects already. So you might find that you only extract 4 or 5 variables in total. And one of the things just to be aware in this process is to think ahead. In particular, if you want to use filters to tailor your evidence map, which comes from user perspective, those would then translate into your variables for data extraction. To also then note that for the data extraction process, as in full reviews, it is quite important to think through the data management aspect of that and what technology you will use. And in mapping, this has the additional complication that for most of these interactive interfaces, you need to set up the data in certain formats. For example, JSON format or in the R software package. And you really would want to do that while you do the data extraction and not afterwards, because otherwise you have to reorganize your entire data extracted. So it's important to keep in mind at the beginning that your data management software or system, you need to be able to export directly out of it into whatever application you use for data visualization. So that compatibility becomes quite important. And as far as I know, the only major review software that will soon have an inbuilt mapping capability is Epi Reviewer 4, or which will be soon 5 actually. Coming then to critical appraisal in evidence maps. So as I said, it's not conducted in all, probably not even majority of evidence maps. Where it is conducted, it's often only done for a subset of studies. So for example, 3IE only does critical appraisal on systematic reviews, not primary studies included in the map. And where it is then done at a full scale, it's usually not the in-depth critical appraisal risk of bias tools that you would expect for, say, a Cochrane review, for example. It's much more of a rapid, high-level understanding to get a sense of the trustworthiness of the evidence, rather than a really, really detailed assessment of the risk of bias. So it's probably, it then does target, was the evidence, was the research reported transparently, does the study fit, does the study design fit the research question, etc. So you don't quite have scope to go into so much detail, which you can imagine studies to go, and it's a massive job to do in-depth critical appraisal. And if you don't go into synthesis anyway, it's a bit of a the value added is, I think there's a question mark behind it. To say or to warn though that quite often, particularly in decision maker contexts and in policy contexts, we've been requested to do critical appraisal in particular. So it was quite important in these particular contexts. Coming then to the last step in the evidence mapping process, and I will show you a few lovely graphics just now. So as I said, there's no synthesis per se in an evidence map, but that doesn't mean that there's not interesting findings or analysis going on. And in my mind, there's really two core components of this organization, analysis, and visualization of the evidence base. So the first one is the organization of the evidence base for versatile analysis and reporting. And the second one has then to do with the use of the evidence base through visualization and the interactive software approaches. And that also mirrors how the technology is actually set up. So for the mapping technologies that we use, they both have a back end and a front end. And at the back end, you usually store all the relevant data. And that then facilitates your analysis and reporting of the data. Whereas the front end is largely for the visualization of the evidence base and to tailor it for user interaction. And that's quite important to keep this distinction in mind if we go forward. So then what can we really offer in the analysis? So as I said, no formal synthesis like meta-analysis or thematic synthesis, but we still can do quite a bit. So maps do give descriptive overviews about the size of the evidence. For example, where is the saturation? Where can we go to full reviews? Where are the gaps? And at the same time, they also give you these high-level patterns in the evidence base. Is the evidence base mainly RCTs, or is it mainly in a particular region, for example? So there is quite a bit that we get through these frequencies and simple cross-tabulation and filterings just by looking at the size and nature of the evidence base from an analysis perspective. From an output perspective, we also get this organized and pre-appraised body of evidence, which is the resource in its own right, particularly for decision makers say we want to move into rapid response services. And most evidence maps also give you actually summaries of the individual pieces of evidence included in the evidence map. So if you're just interested in a subset of all the evidence provided, you can drill down into these two. So the next slides are really just to give you a flavor of the different types of approaches there are to visualize evidence maps. So there's, I think, the bubble approach, which quite a few organizations have used, which is a software solution in which you use bubbles to represent the size of the evidence, often two types of bubbles for different types. So the big bubble here is impact evaluations, and the small bubble here is systematic reviews. And then there's filters here on top to tailor this interface to your decision makers' needs. And there's quite a few people doing this. So this is our own software. This is how it currently looks at the Department for Planning, Monitoring, Evaluation. Same approach, different visuals. 3IE has started this, and I'll show you a very quick tutorial on this. Those ones after I've showed you the others. That's why it's in orange. So I'll come back to these. But yeah, it's kind of the most popular or most adopted approach, and this is also where Campbell will be moving with their evidence maps. A slightly different approach, same thinking. Here you see a heat map that is produced in the R software package. Again, you have an intervention to outcome framework here. You see the size of the evidence. If you click on this number, again, a pop-up would open and you can actually interact and see all the studies included. Yeah, so heat map based on our software. Here you can see a heat map just in Microsoft Excel, so very low cost option. But again, it gives you the visualization, I think, fairly nicely. You have here the type of education, on top the type of health conditions, and you can see with the green where there's lots of evidence for which a configuration, and in red where there's not that much. Yeah, so in terms of visual, a very low cost approach that works quite quickly and fairly well. Completely different approach taken here by the evidence-based synthesis programs, the evidence map of mindfulness, in which you are mapping the size of the literature versus the actual reported effect. So the actual effect sizes contained within these systematic reviews, which shows you that you can play around quite a bit with a framework for evidence maps. Next, you see an evidence map by Sightsavers, which yet again has taken a different approach, where we have health conditions on top, and on the left, we have actually the strength of the evidence assessment. So it's a great assessment with the different reviews in this case and their own quality plotted against these. So yet again, a different way to use the same principle or concept. And now, hoping that technology doesn't fail me, I just wanted to give you a very quick teaser of the functionalities of evidence maps using 3IE's software for evidence maps. If you're interested in playing around for yourself, they have quite a few, and the link in the slide, which will be shared afterwards. And if you just Google 3IE and then evidence maps, you would find the same. So yeah, so I hope you can still see my screen. And now we're on 3IE's page, and there's quite a few evidence maps, as I've said. And I've just opened the one on productive safety nets already. And so here you see the map in front of you. If you hover over, oh, here we go. So it might be a slight delay. If you hover over a bubble, it opens up and it shows you the type of evidence contained within it. If you click on the study here, it either takes you straight to the summary of it or to a PDF of the full text. It differs the different mapping approaches, but usually the link between the primary study here and what's in the bubble is a given. And on top here, you also see the number of impact evaluations, etc. And as you can see from this outcome, you see from the visual, you see very quickly where there's no evidence at all. The filtering function for evidence maps allows you to tailor quite a bit to make your map relevant to the user. So say we only want to see the evidence in sub-Saharan Africa, we can choose a filter here, and then we can update the chart, and you see how it has changed very quickly. Now there are more bubbles have appeared, so 3IE does distinguish between impact evaluations and systematic reviews. And the color here indicates the quality of the systematic review. All of these softwares do allow you to export this data in different formats, and you can tailor it in whatever way you like. Usually comes with a little report, a little bit of background as to how it has been produced. And yeah, so I would encourage you to play around with these if you're more interested. We have our own maps as well as our website. So yeah, and others just get in touch if you want to know a bit more on that. So about to stop here for quick questions on the technology side, but just to leave you on a note of technology, which probably would be a question on how do you actually do that. It's quite important to think about the technology at the get-go, particularly as that your data management fits in nicely. Current technology options that are now have been used for evidence map, it's a JSON export out of API Reviewer. So this is literally, if you're familiar with API Reviewer, you can export your data straight out of that without any technical coding ability. And there then is a tailored wizard to create an evidence map for this particular format. Other options used for techie people is a mix of SharePoint and SQL-based solutions. As well, also already mentioned the R software packages. 3IE is an interesting case. So their mapping software is not technically open access, but you can't own it. So you can send them your data set, and they do help you to create the evidence map for you using their software. And then if you're looking to just get going, a really good low-cost option is, in terms of visuals, is heat maps combined with macros in Microsoft Excel, actually. So I would then like to stop here for 5 minutes on more technical clarification questions, keeping in mind that we still have 10 minutes of content on what is the exact difference between reviews and evidence maps, as well as how they can be used. So I think Solange, I'll then hand back over to you to facilitate the questions.
Thanks, Laurenz. So I'll just ask if anybody has a question, they can unmute themselves and pose the question to Laurenz. If no one has any question, I think we can just proceed.
Quick one.
Oh, okay.
Colin here from Uganda.
Hi there.
Yeah, hi there. I'm very interested in getting to build skills in this evidence mapping processes. So I was just wondering how I can participate and learn, and also participate in systematic reviews, because until I left the Commonwealth Scholarship in Liverpool, I was basically focusing on benefiting from the Cochrane Library as a user, but not as a participant who participates in reviewing. Thank you.
Thank you. So your question is how can you train on doing evidence maps?
Yes, yes.
Okay, thank you. Cochrane South Africa does not have any particular training on evidence mapping. I don't know, Laurenz, if you can provide suggestions for Colin?
Yes, so I would agree that there's certainly a bit of a lack of training. So we will offer a training in August, an introductory one at the Africa Center for Evidence. There will also be workshops on this at the Evidence 2018 conference. And 3IE does provide training as part of workshops too. But if you're looking for some formalized trainings that has been established and has been around, I'm afraid at this point it's not yet available. But we certainly would be very happy to provide mentoring or kind of co-production if you want to get involved in the maps that we're working on. So we're very, very open to build capacity in this particular field.
Thank you. So I'd encourage you, Colin, to contact Laurenz after the webinar. I have another question from Leva. So the question is, when using the software for evidence mapping, can you export the evidence map to send it to a third party? Or does the third party also need the same software to be able to see or open the evidence map?
Yeah, that's a very quick yes. So you actually get an HTML file that you can share with anybody at any time or embed in your website. So yeah, you can. People don't need software to open or use the evidence maps.
Okay.
Great, thanks.
Hi, Solange. I have a question, if you're able.
Hi, Michael.
Hi. Thank you for the talk thus far. I have a quick question. So if you were to rank from easiest to most difficult regarding the tools that one can use to do evidence mapping, including R and 3IE and so forth, which ones in your experience is the easiest to use and the most user-friendly?
So the easiest certainly would be Excel, but from the interactive ones, without being too biased, I think the EpiReviewer one is probably the easiest. So if you've used EpiReviewer before, it is literally just setting up your coding structure and then exporting it through a tab that's called Export into JSON. And then there's a wizard in which you literally upload your JSON file, and then the wizard creates a map for you. So that is my personal opinion, the easiest, and that's also actually partly developed by us. So that's why I have a slight bias, but I find that export wizard approach the easiest currently.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I think you can proceed, Laurenz.
Okay, brilliant. Yeah, so I think when talking through the different steps for evidence maps, I think I've highlighted a few differences already. So this is really a summary slides on what I've touched on before. So key differences when it comes to setting the question is really differences between maps and full reviews or different types of evidence synthesis. Is that evidence maps deal with broader questions and are more descriptive and less normative. So if you want to know what works, then evidence maps only can tell you and organize for you the evidence on what works, but it will not give you the normative answer that intervention A works, intervention B doesn't work. So it's more descriptive, much broader in terms of setting the question. Also in terms of the conceptual scope, so evidence maps in this definition adopted for this talk are organized around this mapping framework, usually two-dimensional. So to say there's also now 3D and 5D mapping approaches. But that also makes them, to be fair, conceptually less complex. So it's not this elaborate theory of change, different diagrams. Not to say there's not theory informed, but I don't think that's the same level of conceptually complexity than do usual, in particular, full systematic reviews. Inclusion criteria. I think evidence maps can much easier include multiple types of evidence. I think while you can have different maps for different types of evidence, as for reviews, I think one of the key strengths is that you can include a broader spectrum of evidence within one map, as you would be struggling if you try to do that within one review. Searching and screening for evidence. I don't think there's any differences, as mentioned. In terms of the data extraction and coding, the key difference here is that evidence map really only code on high-level characteristics, because I need to categorize studies to facilitate filtering function rather than going into synthesis. Critical appraisal, again, it depends. Some maps don't do it at all, but where it is constructed, it is certainly not as extensive as you do in a Cochrane review or also other types of reviews. Synthesis, evidence maps do not conduct formal synthesis at all. And that then also links to the use of the product. In this definition, I think evidence maps really are primarily to develop a responsive evidence base to inform both future research production as well as decision making. It is not this normative use of one product that gives you the answer to a certain policy question. And then just to give you this graphic, which I won't go into detail, but is to point you to two papers by Bertie Snillsmith, who's actually has this really lovely table of showing different types of systematic reviews, evidence synthesis, and systematically how they differ and how different types of evidence maps differ from these as well. So if you're really interested in the kinks, how all these broad level of our lovely evidence synthesis methods differ, then I would point you towards her publication to go into more detail. So then really just from our side, in a very, I think a bit more approachable way, like I think evidence maps are on the spectrum of evidence synthesis methods, and just to position them very quickly between literature reviews, rapid evidence, these are more descriptive overview of knowledge. So if literature reviews, as we all know, they like to discuss a body of knowledge, make normative statements, so not really based on research, etc. We have our slight problems with them in terms of methodological approach, but they describe existing knowledge, they don't necessarily generate new knowledge, and they might do a synthesis or might not do a synthesis, but it is a discussion of the body of knowledge. Probably if we have the spectrum that we're trying to get onto, it starts there. Whereas in our systematic reviews, we have the full appraisal and synthesis of the body of knowledge. We have the normative statement. We have the gold standard to evidence synthesis to an approach. So now we're at the far end of the spectrum. And in rapid evidence assessments, here we try a very quick approach to synthesis and appraisal of evidence. We don't compromise our cost steps, but we find shortcuts around them. And it is particularly tailored for our purpose. So I think these are fairly common synthesis products, and then we bring evidence maps into these. So that seems to be so yeah, there seems to be a slight typo. Apologies. So they're about the high-level patterns and the structures within the research landscape. So to give you this high-level overview, and I think they have been to some extent developed to make systematic reviews more policy relevant. And sorry, I was hoping this slide would have come first. So it is to say that evidence maps do give you this high-level overview of a research landscape. So if you look into the research landscape, you see the patterns, the pathways very quickly. And while you can do this from a very high-level point of view, you can also zoom into the different bodies of knowledge on a map, and it gives you the granular patterns of the evidence base, the more micro-level patterns. What it doesn't give you, though, is this high-level structure, is this ready-to-go track that has all the evidence answered, ready to go to your policymakers. So, as these 2 points on the overview point out, it shows you where you are and where you might be going, but it doesn't tell you which is the best way to take. So, an evidence map is a bit more like this, where you've gone into the overall research landscape and you have pre-packaged this, and you are now ready to pick up these bulbs of evidence and synthesize them or give them to your decision maker. But you don't yet have this ready to go answer and take it forward. So to then sum up this positioning, it is really, evidence maps are part of this family of evidence synthesis methods, and they're being but one approach. And I think that's quite important to also acknowledge at this point that they are a tool for a particular purpose. So they by no means can answer all questions or relevant in all research settings or needed in all reviews at all. But I do think they are part of this wider family of evidence synthesis methods. And I think they have a role to play in this family. So then, concluding then to what role do they actually play? And in this talk, I've kind of separated this into the role they play to support systematic reviews, as well as the role they play to support policy. So within systematic reviews, I think they can take 4 key functions. So the first one is that they can help quite a bit to tailor the scope of an existing review. So we had this in the review of labor market intervention recently, where we've done an evidence map first to then discuss with the funders, what does this evidence map mean for the scope of the review? Where do we go? Like which types of evidence do we want to synthesize? What synthesis methods do we want to apply? Do we do a qualitative synthesis for this particular aspect of the evidence base and a quantitative synthesis for different aspects, etc. So it was really helpful to tailor the scope with the funder or with the stakeholder within a review project, so at the beginning. And in particular, it helps you avoid empty reviews, so you can see quickly from a map where the gaps are and where then also there wouldn't be evidence for a full review. It also helps you avoid monster reviews. So that was the case in our labor market review, where the initial scope was far too broad, and being able to show to the funder that, well, there is this 400 impact evaluations on this broad topic. Like, we will need 3 or 4 years to do a review of these. And so which are the actual pattern bodies of evidence that you're most interested in? And then we can tailor your review to these. That was very helpful. And likewise, it also can help you avoid a misfit between the question you ideally want to answer in your review and the evidence that is actually available for it. So if you really want to answer what works question from readers, for example, but the map shows you that there's no impact evaluations available, you might have to reframe your question because otherwise your synthesis will not be targeted correctly. So that's kind of the first one, how to use an evidence map to tailor the scope of a review. The second one is a bit more conceptual on how they can be used within a wider research project to scope actual research priorities, to then conduct different types of reviews based on that. So we had a project on ecosystem services for poverty evaluation, in which we had a massive evidence map to start with stakeholder engagement to understand where do the research priorities lie within the stakeholders. And after we had the research priorities and the evidence mapped against it, we then conducted different types of systematic reviews on this, on the priorities identified on the map. So in sum, these 2 points are, I think, about using maps to improve the production of systematic reviews to better target research areas fertile for full reviews, as well as what review design to subscribe to. The last two reasons are slightly less on the production. It's a bit more from a funders and stakeholders perspective. So for funders, we've been in discussion with quite a few, it is quite helpful to target the commissioning of full systematic reviews. So I know that 3IE, DFID, and the AIDS Alliance, for example, have used maps in this regard. And yeah, I think it makes sense because you do see where there's evidence available for systematic reviews, where there's gaps in the evidence where you might want to commission your primary research rather. And linked to that, the last one really is the use of maps to be a stakeholder engagement tool. So we found it really helpful through this interactive evidence interface in particular to make the evidence base available, feelable or live for stakeholders. So being able to play around with the map, tailoring it to your own purpose. This type of interaction gives the evidence a different voice and gives the project that then follows, may it's a review or the full review or the rapid evidence synthesis, it gives it a different link to the stakeholder. We've found the maps quite helpful in that regard. And just from a practical point of view, there's in particular when you start with a big question, there's quite a bit of how the map can help your systematic review to be targeted, your research commissioning tool to be targeted. So if you have a map of the evidence and you find that there's interventions but no evidence, well, you probably need to commission research first. You can't go straight into the intervention. Likewise, if you have a scenario in which you have no intervention in place, but the map shows there's lots of good evidence, well, you can then skip both the review and the primary research process and probably go within the commencing the intervention. On the other hand, if you have quite a bit of, if the map shows there's quite a bit of research on a particular topic, but it doesn't quite tell you what to do, then you definitely don't have to do any primary research, but you can go into a full systematic review. Whereas if you have a scenario on the map where there's no intervention and no research, you probably need to pilot and do research. So, and that's just a snapshot of a few scenarios how maps can help target both systematic reviews as well as primary research production. And then leaving on the role of maps to support policymaking, which is kind of the user engagement side of it. So it's quite interesting that people differ slightly about it. So 3IE, for example, but Stilswitz writes that evidence maps are a new addition to the tools available for evidence-informed policymaking. Likewise, DPME has put policy-relevant evidence map as a method to inform decision-making in the public sector, whereas Campbell actually says systematic reviews are to inform policy, whereas evidence maps are primarily to inform research priorities. So I would position, I think, maps quite strongly on the policy-making side. So I think there's quite a bit that you can do with it. I'll show 2 or 3 examples now. So it's not just a research commissioning tool in our understanding. So this is a map that DPME has produced. And what's striking about it is that the framework for the map was based on policy frameworks. So on top, you had the policy outcomes as outlined in the medium-term strategic framework based on the National Development Plan. Whereas on the left, you had interventions aligned with the current, what was then current housing white paper. So by mapping these two against each other, you were mapping essentially evidence against policy priorities, which showed you very quickly if you had a gap on the map, as here, that was an actual decision-making gap. So there was a policy instrument that was being considered and an outcome in the NDP, but no evidence available against it. So really difficult for the department to do policy in this particular configuration. And I think by using these policy frameworks for evidence maps, you bring in a dimension that in a research map you do not have, and you actually move closer to addressing decision-making needs and policy questions, which I do think is a tool for evidence-informed decision-making, even if it doesn't give you the answer straight. In particular, the, again, DPME map, there's a whole approach behind it. The idea, if maps are about stakeholder engagement, to have a co-production approach between researchers and decision makers, which changes then how research is being commissioned. So the interaction between decision makers and researchers is something that maps facilitate quite nicely, which again moves it closer to becoming a decision-making tool in its own right. And as a summary, then this is different applications that DPME has scoped how the evidence map could be used in a policy context. So just to highlight a few where that we don't usually have in a research context. So just they have the evidence map as an organizational tool to raise awareness for evidence-based policymaking in general. So to visualize the evidence, to let people interact is actually first step towards evidence-informed decision-making, just to raise awareness, which again, from research perspective, we might not necessarily see it in this way. Likewise, in a policy context, the use of maps as an accountability tool. So for people taking particular policy decisions, the evidence maps then shows very quickly whether or not there's actually evidence behind that particular policy position. So it does increase the voice of evidence in a policy sphere. And yeah, so this is just a snapshot of the different ways in which DPME had conceptualized these. And yeah, so again, I think lots of potential for future work using particular different policy frameworks and to structure evidence maps. This is a policy cycle. You could very well structure a map around this rather than the outcome intervention approach. So I think that's just to highlight, to make the point again that you can tailor evidence maps to be a policy relevant tool. And as Howard White here has done, he actually positions evidence maps as part of a wider evidence infrastructure. That if you have an effective knowledge broker evidence ecosystem, he positions evidence maps here firmly within it. Again, to underline the point that I think maps are more than just a research commissioning or priority tool. And then to leave this very quickly, because I promised that there are 3D maps. It's just a picture of a 3D map to show you where it might be going. Don't want to scare you. I think 2D maps are absolutely enough. Yeah, but they are out there. So thank you very much. And yeah, my apologies. I think I went a bit over, but yeah, very happy to take questions. And yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Laurenz. You haven't gone over time yet. So open for any questions?
Yes, Colin here.
Hi, Colin.
Thank you very much, Laurenz, for your presentation. I have been involved in using Atlas TI for qualitative analysis, and I just wanted to ask, based on my experience around Atlas, I think Atlas could be used as part of those softwares to generate evidence maps. What do you think? Thank you.
So you're exposing me. So I haven't used Atlas. I'm aware of it. I would need to know a little bit more about how data is organized within it to give you an exact answer. So yeah, my apologies. I can't give this a straight yes or no. I think it's a qualified yes that from my limited use and understanding of it, I do think it should work.
Okay, any other questions? You can also post a question in the chat box. Okay, we've got a question from Dr. Wallace in Kenya about where he can source the software from.
Yeah, so it depends a bit which software again. So if you're interested in this use of EpiReviewer and JSON, so EpiReviewer is commercially available, and then they are busy on programming the wizard currently, and we also have a small wizard at the moment. So if you have a data set in JSON, then we can help with that currently, and soon Epi will be too. If you're just at the beginning, you could approach 3IE. So they are, at the moment, they want to pilot their own evidence mapping software for other people. So you can send them an email and say you want to do an evidence map on this, and this is how your data set is going to look like. Can they help you with their software? So that you would just have to contact them. For the R software-based solutions, you'd have to purchase that. Again, that is commercially only available, you probably could get in touch with the evidence-based, so the SNAP evidence-based conversation groups that I listed, who have kind of taken this particular approach to mapping the furthest. So they could probably give you the code and the macros, so you wouldn't have to start from scratch, but you would still have to purchase R software if your university doesn't have that.
Thanks, Laurenz. There's another question from Michael in Tanzania who asks about, so if we don't look into the quality evidence when we do evidence mapping, how do you deal with it before going into an intervention or other recommendations? Do you make any recommendations from it?
That's a really good question. So I think you probably don't make normative recommendations on evidence maps usually. So I think that's the general answer. There's a few exceptions to that rule, obviously. So, for example, if somebody's taken a very strong stance to a particular intervention, and the map shows there's no evidence for this intervention at all, we can make a recommendation to say, currently, this intervention is certainly not evidence-informed. Be cautious. So that type of recommendation we could make. But in terms of answering normative question as to, say, do demand-side subsidies work for poverty reduction in South Africa? What the only recommendation really on this map that we have is, well, there's 20 studies that have looked at this question, and these are done. Half of them are done in Limpopo, the other half are done in Gauteng, or in whatever. Sorry, what your province is in your respective country. So you can't really say what works or how or why does it work. So if you're looking for actual tangible recommendation on normative basis, then I don't think evidence map is the right tool. You would need some form of formal synthesis for that.
Okay, thank you. Our time is up. Are you happy for attendees to email you if they have any questions?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Great. Thank you so much then, Laurenz. Really interesting. Thank you so much for your presentation.
No, thank you for the opportunity. And yeah, I think we'll share the presentation as well for people interested. So yep. Yeah, if you need to use it as a resource.
Thank you everyone for attending. We will share the presentation and we will share the video recording of the webinar as well. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
That was just for the bye.
Yeah. So that he knows his people there. Just gonna ask you,
Thank you, it was nice.